So I've finally been attacking my backlog over the last few months, and in the process of doing so, I realized that I've been putting a lot of JRPGs on the back burner. And if you need an example of how hard I've been putting some of these off exactly, I've had a sealed copy of Octopath Traveler sitting on my shelf for like 2 years now. But I finally got to it and it was pretty dope. But when I finished it, I wanted to go ahead and get to something I bought that came out this year, which led me to Triangle Strategy, another Square Enix RPG. And it's funny because I remembered ordering a US copy of this, but I guess it must have been in high demand or something because they sent me a foreign copy instead. Way to go, Jeff Bezos. Regardless, Triangle Strategy is a strategy RPG as the name implies. And if you're not exactly sure what that means, think Fire Emblem if you're a Nintendo fan, or if you're an old head Square Enix fan, think Final Fantasy Tactics, because Triangle Strategy is as much an homage to that game as Octopath was to the original Final Fantasy games. And these two games also have the same producer, Tomoya Asano, and they use the same HD 2D pixel graphic style, which has really been favored a lot lately, and it's getting seen more and more across the board, what with the Live Alive remix that recently came out, and how they're also planning to work on that Dragon Quest III remake that I personally can't wait for. But to be honest, graphics aren't usually like an instant hook for me. It takes more than that. So I was interested in what this game had to offer. And now that I've played this game, I figured it was a good time to talk about it. With all that said, here is my review for Triangle Strategy on Nintendo Switch.
Hey, yo, Giant, let's go!
Darkness engulfs you!
Death from above! For the honor of House Wolfort!
Triangle Strategy is a story about the land of Norzelia, which is comprised of the verdant kingdom of Glenbrook, the snowy Grand Duchy of Esfrost, and the sprawling desert that is the holy state of Hyzant. These three countries are currently living through an armistice after they waged what was known as the Salt Iron War. This war was fought over the continent's finite resources, each of them the boon of their respective sovereignties, Glenbrook controlling the vast water supply of the land, Esfrost overseeing the production of iron, and Hyzant governing the continent's singular source of salt. Side note, at first I thought it was kind of silly how these people were actually fighting because they were salty over not having salt, but I guess that's first world problems. 3 decades after this conflict, you take control of Serenoa Wolfort, heir to House Wolfort. His house, situated in Glenbrook, is revered across the land, due in no small part to his father Simon Wolfort's exploits during the Salt Iron War, playing a pivotal role in ending it. We join Serenoa during a transitional period of his life, a time where he's preparing both for taking leadership of the house, as well as an arranged marriage to Frederica Esfrost, Princess of Esfrost, which is meant to foster relations between the two countries. We're also introduced early on to the political workings of the three countries as they're setting up a joint venture with the Grand Norzelian mines. These mines are originally meant to be beneficial to all parties, but the overseer Dragan, cousin to Frederica and the Archduke of Esfrost Gustadolf, makes a surprising discovery within that shocks and excites him. We don't learn what that is, but whatever it is, it leads him to make an attempt at a political power play that leads to his assassination. This happens as House Wolfort visits the mines for an inspection, which in turn leads to them, and more importantly Glenbrook itself, being framed for Dragan's murder and inciting war anew amongst the countries. Serenoa must navigate the ensuing conflict, accompanied by characters like Frederica, his best friend and Prince of Glenbrook Roland, veteran House Wolfort members Benedict and Eridor, among many others, journeying from conflict to conflict. Moving on from these inciting incidents, and even not too long before this, the story told is largely dictated by Serenoa's, aka your, choices. When Simon passes leadership of House Wolfort onto Serenoa, he also gives him the scales of conviction. Oftentimes throughout the plot, the party becomes divided on which course of action to take during certain important moments. In a move that I personally love, that's where the scales come in. You don't just choose the path to take, you and your party vote on it. Everybody takes a stance, and you can try to persuade them to vote for whichever side you choose personally. And even then, that's not guaranteed, because it depends on Serenoa's convictions. Through conversation, exploration, and even through battle itself, Serenoa gains points towards 3 conviction stats: liberty, morality, and utility. In your first playthrough, you are never aware of where your convictions sit on the meter. You only gain access to that when you complete complete the game for subsequent playthroughs. You're left to infer what choices affect what stat initially. You're encouraged more than I'm aware of in other RPGs to either answer in a way true to yourself or to try to answer in a way that might pursue a certain other line of thinking. You're directly challenged to think about what is inherently good or bad. In certain situations, this just shows strength in certain rationales, and these invisible numbers directly represent whether or not you can coerce people to see your point of view during voting sections. But regardless, whatever decision is reached, you have no choice but to accept it and move forward in the story. An example of the situations where this becomes necessary is the first one. You end up voting on whether to go on a diplomatic trip to Esfrost or Hyzant, respectively. Serenoa sees benefits in either road, but every character present has their own opinion, and even that early on in the game, this influences the course of the story. This choice, as well as others, put you down certain narrative branches that yield exclusive outcomes, battles, and even party members. There's multiple endings to the story, so it'd be hard to cover every deviation, and it's crazy because I already feel like I'm talking about gameplay, but that's how well the moral metagame ties into it. It's definitely interesting to explore, but it's served well by its gameplay at the same time, so let me dig into that. If you missed the comparison I made in the beginning, this is a tactics RPG that pays homage to strategy classics the same way Octopath did for the original Final Fantasy games. If you ever played Final Fantasy Tactics, Disgaea, and of course Fire Emblem being the most recognizable name in this genre these days, then you have a surface level understanding of what you're getting into here. You control a certain number of units, each using certain weapon or spell types and specializing in certain terrain. In the most basic way I can compare, if you've never played a strategy RPG, it's kind of like playing chess with your units. Between battles, you get to swap, place, and use your units as you see fit. As such, you only have yourself to blame if things don't work out. But thankfully, unlike Fire Emblem or similar games, permadeath isn't a thing at all here, so you can rest easy if you lose a unit because you don't have to reset the game in a panic if you didn't do everything perfectly. That said, it feels like the game's difficulty is scaled higher for that reason alone, because the second you get careless and lose one or two of your best units, things have the potential to fall apart fast. Proper planning, usage of support and attack skills, and spacing is key, and if you handle your team right, you'll be sure to see victory throughout your many battle scenarios. In between battles, however, you can visit your team's encampment to restock items and upgrade weapons. Every character's weapons are unique to them, and you spend resources accrued throughout the adventure to not only increase the base attack and defense stats for each character, but you can unlock passive bonuses and new skills on top. You can also level up each character's class throughout the story and using special items the same way you could with Master Seals and Fire Emblem. Unlike Fire Emblem though, you don't need to wait until you fully level a character to class up. No matter the class, the level of the character doesn't reset when you change them, so it's advantageous to do so as early and thoughtfully as you see fit. Lastly, you can participate in mental mock battles, practice fights that offer items on the first time completion and are replayable so as to allow for training up lesser used or new characters. They're not especially difficult, so they can probably come off a little boring if you repeat these a lot, but they add more as the story progresses though, and they try to shake it up by adding challenges to break up the monotony of it all. There's plenty to do in the encampment, and they, along with battlefields before fights start, can be explored freely in 3D movement, so that's nice for some light exploration. I also think it's cool that all of the merchants in the encampment can end up joining your team, and my personal favorite of them is Archibald, low-key the best archer in the game, even though he doesn't get as much movement as Huette. Never underestimate the obligatory old war vet. Throughout the game, the battles show an honestly surprising level of depth within them. Not only does the height of terrain play into it with certain elevations aiding in attack and defense, but higher elevations also give archers more range. Weather conditions are also taken into account, with certain weather affecting things like the accuracy of archers or the spell potency of mages. But within the varied terrain of the game's settings, grassy fields and wooden barricades can catch fire and burn for multiple turns, damaging units that pass through their spaces. Snowy or icy fields, on the other hand, impede the movement of certain units and also keep some skills from being used, but they can also be melted with fire spells to create wet, watery areas. And wet areas can either be frozen over with ice spells or shocked with lightning to conduct electricity throughout all adjacent wet spaces, which not only deals damage to all units inside those spaces, but has a chance to paralyze anyone that gets hit. It's all very clever, and these systems can be exploited by either side, so you have to be careful not to be taken advantage of. It honestly left me tense in a number of fights, and the later chapters saw me experimenting with almost all of my units, which I was glad to see, because battles near the end had me sweating. As I mentioned before though, the story offers unique battles and exclusive units depending on the route taken throughout the story. So even though I managed to get the golden route, which is Triangle Strategy's true ending, I'm tempted to boot up that New Game Plus to see what I'm missing out on. Not to mention that Serenoa's ever-strengthening conviction stats also unlock new units when reaching certain milestones, such as those merchant characters and more, so there's always a chance you might have missed out on some pretty useful additions. Thankfully, there's more than just gameplay to keep you going. There's plenty to love with both your eyes and ears to complete this package. Aside from the obviously pretty HD 2D graphical style popularized by Octopath that I'm sure you've already noticed as I've been doing all this talking, it's 100% following the trend of reliving the retro feel with modern additions via 3D environments and such. It's used in this instance to channel the Final Fantasy Tactics vibes, but the audio in this game gives plenty to consider as well. Building on the feeling of old, the soundtrack features a lot of bombastic military tracks that help lend to this game's Game of Thrones-y shtick. It's cool to hear the numerous iterations of the song you hear during the sortie prep across the battles of the game. It's like the main battle theme, built to stick in your head to help cement the atmosphere of the fights, and it's really dynamic. The music also switches up during battles depending on the way the tides are turning, so that totally lays on the tension. It's iterated on a few times throughout the game, which is cool, but I'm glad there's more originals throughout. One of my favorite tracks is the song Destiny. Which played during only 2 battles in the story round I experienced, but I won't spoil any of that for you because you should be experiencing those yourself. There were moments where that song just elevated the whole thing. Game of Thrones joke aside, the tone of it all feels to me as though it's masterfully dealing with that whole aura of politics, corruption, death and war, and it's complemented by the voice acting, even though I don't think all of the performances in this game are top tier. Looking at you, Serenoa. Some characters are just here making attempts at accents and gravitas, and I don't think it all lands, but I appreciate that the strong majority of this game is voiced. You only really miss out on voice acting in the encampment and pre-battle exploration sections, but those are more to break up the pace because the scenes and conversation can run on a little long. A lot of it is set dressing for the politics that these characters talk you through. They throw in a lot of exposition dumps and world building via these scenes, so you usually do a healthy amount of talking before getting into one big fight per chapter. Oftentimes there's dramatic music punctuating the heated discussions to emphasize the tone the game is going for, and they also emphasize the more contemplative moments like when you're trying to persuade people during the scales of conviction sections. At the end of the day, this game doesn't hold back. People die, choices matter, battles are hard fought, and the entire way it's brought to you with little hand-holding.
War is hell.
You're made to feel these politics, these fights, and the decisions that oftentimes may not be the ones you want, but they are the ones that you resolve to see through with your comrades. I think overall this game succeeds in presenting you with an experience that only reveals more layers the more you peel them away. To sum it up in a sentence, Triangle Strategy could very well be my RPG of the year. Jumping into it, I had no idea that I was going to be playing such a solid game, and it's been a while since I was so invested in a strategy RPG. I didn't even bother finishing Fire Emblem 3 Houses, but this game hooked me and I couldn't put it down until it was done. Almost 70 hours later, I highly recommend it if you're looking to scratch that itch. I was definitely happy to cover another RPG because it's been a while since I talked about one on the channel. I guess I'll see which one is going to be the next one that hooks me enough to want to talk about it, whenever that is. But that's going to be it for the video. Thank you all for your time, and if you have any thoughts about Triangle Strategy, feel free to lay them in the comments. But I'm going to get moving, so I hope you guys had a good time. Talk to you on the next one.